The deeper I look into Egypt, the more I realize something. Egypt did not go away. We are living on the backs of the work of the ancient Egyptians. Think about it. What part of our modern civilization is not brought forth by Egyptians? And I don't mean they lived in the past and made it first. I mean, what part of our modern civilization was not impacted directly by Egyptians? The entire Western world, Eastern world, is affected mostly by the ancient Egyptians. If Egypt did not affect the rest of Africa, that means Africa is the only place outside of the Americas and Australia, is the only place that was connected to Egypt that was not affected by Egypt. Now, I don't know if this makes sense to you, but I'll say it again. Literature comes from Egypt and then spreads throughout nations. And I'm not saying there was no literature before the Egyptians or at the same time as the Egyptians. I mean, the literature that we use to write comes directly from the Egyptians. And I've showed videos that show this. Certain technologies like camel riding, which today we associate with Arabia, comes from North Africa and that region of Egypt and Ethiopia. And various things like paper comes from Egypt. Uh, the alphabet comes from Egypt. Even our modern religion of Christianity comes from Egypt in more than one way. Let's break it down. First of all, we have seen too many parallels between Osiris and Jesus as a theme, which probably means that Jesus, ideas about Jesus were borrowed from Osiris. And it also means that the actual Christians who were Copts added things that were relevant to their experience. Now, of course, there's something else that added into Christianity, and that's the Judeo religion. Now, again, we're talking about Afro Asiatics who left Africa through Egypt. I'm trying to find things that were not impacted by Egypt. Even the use of horses, even though it spread throughout by the Indo Europeans, you don't really see the jump all over the world until you see it being utilized in Egypt. And so for me, Egypt is not just a land that once existed and affects us today in a artistic creative way. We pray, we live, we breathe, we construct our houses, we talk, we feast on the back of the works of the Egyptians. And according to experts, if they are correct that Africa's got nothing to do with Egypt, that means the most unique place that had modern technology in the world is Africa. It must be. If the Egyptians didn't affect them, the Romans didn't affect them, the Japanese didn't affect them, the Chinese didn't affect them, that means our history is the most unique history in history outside of obviously the Americas. Does this make sense to anybody? I want to just address this part. Does it make sense to you that the Egyptians affected lands as far as Britain? Britain, Britain, the land of Britain. And there are Egyptians from ancient times who went to India. So, at what point did they decide that traveling over the sea was easier than traveling over the land? And of course, the only reason why we don't believe that ancient Egyptians traveled the land, simple fact, is because you don't see the same level of sophistication outside of Egypt when it comes to places like Central Africa or further south. In order for them to make a connection, they must see pyramids. It's not good enough that we have buildings 2 stories, 3 stories from ancient times. It's not good enough that we have literally giant obelisks in Ethiopia, which, by the way, at least now they accept that Ethiopia and Somalia must have been a part, at least in culture, a part of Egypt. This is one of the reasons why I try to ignore Ethiopia when I prove my points. Because some people are like, why don't you talk about Nubia? Why don't you talk about Ethiopia? I'm coming to that. The reason why I don't talk about them so far is because I want to prove the hardest questions they have, the ones where they go, there's no way in hell these places are connected to Egypt. And I want to show you that actually there's many things. I remember Joanne Fletcher, an Egyptologist, said something very interesting. She said, Egypt was colonized many times, and though the people were colonized, the culture colonized the colonizers. And truly, this has been a fact for Africa for years. Like I showed you, there are dances all over the world that adopt African stomping. Even though the people in America were brought there forcefully, at least that's the mainstream view, when they were there, their culture was so strong that it literally illuminated through all the rubbish, literally making the population that did not like them be addicted to their culture, which they stayed true to their roots, which is why African Americans are true Africans. And also, if you look at the Africans in Arabia, and I showed you last time that even the religion of Africa is addictive. And of course, Egyptian symbols are all over the world. Egyptian religion, which is through Christianity being adopted, is pushing itself through. Africa is one of the most addictive places ever. And again, I'll say it one more time. There have been civilizations everywhere. Why is Egypt so addictive? Why is it that people abandon their own cultures and claim to be Egyptian? People we know recently colonized Egypt. We even have history books that document this, but they're so addicted to the culture that Africans bring, the richness of the culture, that they claim that they were the true Egyptians.